Blood dripping on imported Italian marble makes a distinct, sickening sound. It is a rhythmic tap that forever haunts a person. For one desperate housekeeper, that sound was not just a warning. It was the brutal beginning of a descent into a criminal underworld where survival meant keeping the devil himself alive. Madeline Hayes knew the golden rule of working at the Rossi compound in Southampton: keep your head down, your eyes averted, and your mouth permanently shut. The sprawling 50-acre estate on Meadow Lane was a fortress disguised as a billionaire's playground, surrounded by 10-foot-high wrought iron fences, discreetly wired with military-grade motion sensors and guarded by men who wore impeccably tailored suits but carried themselves like street brawlers. The estate was entirely isolated from the Hamptons' high society that buzzed just a few miles away. Madeline was not here for the ocean views. She was a 26-year-old former nursing student, drowning in crippling medical debt from her mother's prolonged battle with leukemia. When a discreet placement agency offered her $10,000 a month to manage the cleaning of the Rossi estate's East Wing, she signed the non-disclosure agreements without blinking. She knew exactly who Dominic Rossi was. The federal indictments handed down by the Southern District of New York the previous year had splashed his name across every major newspaper. He was the undisputed head of the Rossi Syndicate, a man who had modernized a brutal criminal empire into a slick, corporate-style operation. For 6 months, her routine had been a masterclass in invisibility. She polished the baccarat crystal chandeliers, dusted the first edition Hemingway novels in the Grand Library, and maintained the pristine sheen of the Brazilian cherrywood floors. She rarely saw Dominic. When she did, he was nothing more than a sharply dressed phantom, a silhouette moving through the hallways accompanied by the low murmur of urgent, hushed conversations. It was a Tuesday night, well past 2 in the morning, when the illusion of safety shattered. Madeline was working a late shift in the Grand Library, applying linseed oil to the intricate wooden paneling near the massive fireplace. The rest of the house was tomb silent. The security detail usually maintained a perimeter outside, leaving the interior of the private wing completely deserted at this hour. As she wiped down a particularly stubborn scuff mark near a built-in mahogany bookshelf, she heard it. A dull, heavy thud. Madeline froze, the rag slipping from her fingers. The sound hadn't come from the hallway. It had come from behind the bookshelf. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Was it a rat? The estate was immaculate, regularly treated by elite exterminators. She pressed her ear against the cool wood of the shelving unit. Silence stretched for an agonizing 10 seconds, and then a distinct, ragged scrape followed by a low, guttural groan. It was a human voice. Someone was inside the wall. Panic urged her to run to alert the guards at the front gate, but the strict instructions of her employment echoed in her mind. Never ask questions. Never enter unauthorized areas. Never see what you aren't supposed to see. Yet the sound of a shallow, wet cough vibrating through the wood paralyzed her. Her fingers traced the edge of the bookshelf. It was an antique piece, seamlessly integrated into the wall architecture. As she ran her hand along the decorative molding at waist height, her thumb snagged on a small, disguised indentation. Without thinking, driven by a terrifying cocktail of curiosity and dread, she pushed. A soft, mechanical click broke the silence. The heavy wooden section, loaded with hundreds of leather-bound books, popped forward a fraction of an inch. Madeline stepped back as the concealed door swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor lined with raw concrete. The metallic tang of copper instantly assaulted her senses. Lying on the floor of the secret passageway, illuminated only by the harsh, flickering emergency LED strips above, was Dominic Rossi. He was practically unrecognizable. The notoriously composed, untouchable crime boss was crumpled against the concrete, his legs splayed awkwardly. His bespoke navy blue suit jacket was shredded, and his crisp white dress shirt was soaked in a spreading, terrifying pool of dark crimson. His head was slumped forward, chin resting on his chest, and his breaths came in wet, labored gasps. "Mr. Rossi?" "Mr. Rossi," Madeline whispered, her voice trembling violently. At the sound of his name, Dominic's head snapped up. Even on the verge of unconsciousness, his survival instincts were terrifying. Before Madeline could even process the movement, his right hand shot out. The cold, heavy steel barrel of a suppressed Beretta 9mm was aimed directly between her eyes. His eyes, usually a cold, calculating slate gray, were feverish and dilated. His hand shook slightly, but the weapon remained deadly steady. "Not a word," Dominic rasped, blood flecking his pale lips. "You scream, you die." Madeline raised her hand slowly, dropping to her knees so she wasn't looming over him. "I'm not screaming," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "I'm the housekeeper." "Madeline." "I was just cleaning the library." Dominic's intense gaze bored into her, searching for deceit. He lowered the gun by a fraction, his head falling back against the concrete wall with a sickening thud. "Close it," he commanded, his voice barely more than a jagged whisper. "Close the door." Scrambling backward, Madeline grabbed the edge of the heavy bookshelf and pulled it shut. The latch engaged with a quiet snick, sealing them inside the claustrophobic, bloody corridor. The sudden confinement amplified the sound of his erratic breathing. "I have to call someone," Madeline said, her nursing instincts momentarily overriding her terror. "I need to get the security team." "Gabriel?" "No!" The sudden roar from Dominic startled her. The effort cost him dearly. He coughed, a violent spasm that sent fresh blood spilling over his hands, which were desperately clutching his abdomen. "No, Gabriel. No guards. You are bleeding to death, Mr. Rossi." "There's a rat," he ground out, squeezing his eyes shut as a wave of agony washed over his sharp features. "Someone on the inside. They knew my route tonight. They knew the blind spots in the city. If my men find me here, the one who put this bullet in me will finish the job." Madeline stared at him in horror. The Rossi empire was built on absolute loyalty. If someone inside his inner circle had orchestrated a hit, this house was a death trap. "Help me out," Dominic demanded, shoving the pistol into the waistband of his ruined trousers. End of the hall. "Safe room." Madeline hesitated for only a second before moving toward him. She wrapped one arm around his waist, her hands immediately stipping on the slick, warm blood soaking his clothes. He slung his heavy, muscular arm over her shoulders, and together they forced themselves upward. He let out a muffled groan, his entire body weight leaning heavily onto her much smaller frame. They staggered down the narrow concrete corridor. The passage seemed endless, every step a monumental battle against gravity and blood loss. Madeline could feel his heart racing erratically against her shoulder. They finally reached a heavy steel door at the end of the hall. Dominic reached out with a trembling hand and pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner. A green light flashed, and the heavy door hissed open. They stumbled into a high-tech medical and tactical panic room. It was stark white, brilliantly lit and lined with security monitors showing every angle of the estate. In the center was a stainless steel medical examination table. "Get me on the table," he grunted. Madeline practically dragged him to the center of the room. He collapsed onto the cold steel with a heavy sigh, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Stay with me," Madeline yelled, slapping his cheek lightly. She couldn't have a dead Mafia boss in her arms. That was a guaranteed death sentence for her. She turned toward the glass-fronted medical cabinets lining the wall. They were stocked better than most trauma centers. She saw IV bags, suturing kits, surgical tools, and heavy-duty painkillers. "You're a nurse," Dominic murmured, watching her through half-closed lids as she tore open packages of sterile gauze and quick clot. "I was a student. 2 years. I didn't finish. Close enough," he coughed. "The bullet, it's still in there. Deflected off a rib, I think. You have to get it out." Madeline stopped dead, a pair of trauma shears in her hand. "I can't perform surgery. I took vitals and changed bedpans. If I dig around in your abdomen, I could nick an artery and kill you. If you don't take it out, "I die of sepsis by morning," he stated coldly, his imposing aura returning despite the blood pooling beneath him. "Do it, or I die, and the men who betrayed me will undoubtedly find you cleaning up the mess." The threat was implicit and entirely real. Swallowing the bile rising in her throat, Madeline grabbed a bottle of surgical iodine, a local anesthetic, a scalpel, and a pair of long hemostatic forceps. She returned to the table and used the shears to cut away the ruined fabric of his shirt. The wound was ugly. The entry hole was just below his right rib cage, jagged and weeping dark blood. The skin around it was bruised a violent purple. "I don't have time to wait for local anesthesia to fully kick in," she warned, her hands surprisingly steady as she prepped the syringe. "Just do it," he growled, grabbing the edge of the steel table until his knuckles turned white. Madeline injected the lidocaine around the wound, waited barely 30 seconds, and picked up the forceps. "Take a deep breath." As she probed the wound, Dominic let out a strangled roar, his entire body going rigid. The intimate, terrifying proximity to this dangerous man made the air in the room feel heavy. She could feel the hard muscle of his abdomen tensing violently under her touch. She dug deeper, her gloved fingers slick with blood, desperately searching for the jagged piece of lead. Clink. The metal forceps scraped against something hard. "Got it," she breathed, clamping down. With a sickening pull, she extracted a deformed 9mm slug, dropping it into a metal kidney basin where it rang out sharply. Dominic's chest heaved as he fought for air. "Pack it. Stitch it." Madeline moved with manic efficiency, packing the cavity with hemostatic gauze to stop the internal bleeding before threading a curved needle to suture the torn muscle and skin. She was completely absorbed in the grisly task, the silence of the panic room broken only by Dominic's heavy breathing and the quiet snapping of latex gloves. Suddenly a crackling sound echoed through the room. It was the intercom system tied to the library. "Boss, are you in there?" Madeline froze, the needle suspended halfway through a stitch. The voice was deep, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. It was Gabriel, Dominic's terrifyingly loyal enforcer, the underboss of the Rossi family. On the bank of security monitors to their left, the camera feed for the Grand Library flickered to life. Gabriel was standing exactly where Madeline had been cleaning just 20 minutes ago. He was flanked by 2 heavily armed guards. The perimeter sensors triggered briefly on the east side. Gabriel's voice echoed through the speaker. "We found blood on the driveway. I need to know you're secure." Dominic's eyes snapped open, locking onto the monitor. He reached out and hit a button on the console next to the table, muting the microphone on their end. "Look at his right hand," Dominic whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of pain and sudden cold fury. Madeline squinted at the high-definition screen. Gabriel was holding his phone in his left hand, but his right hand was wrapped in a makeshift, bloody bandage. "He's the mole," Dominic breathed, the realization hardening his features into a mask of pure violence. "He's the one who shot me." Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the monitor, then at the half-stitched, bleeding crime boss on the table, and finally at her own hands, completely stained in Rossi blood. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was the only witness to a Mafia coup, trapped in a basement with the ousted king. On the high-definition monitor, Gabriel stood directly in front of the mahogany bookshelf, his eyes scanning the library floor. The silence in the panic room was absolute, broken only by Dominic's ragged, shallow breathing. "He doesn't know about this room." "Oh," Dominic whispered, his voice strained as he pressed a fresh wad of sterile gauze against his sutured abdomen. "Only my father and I had the original blueprints drawn up by the Swiss contractors. Gabriel knows there are blind spots in the estate's security, but he doesn't know the architecture." Madeline stared at the screen, her heart dropping into her stomach. "Mr. Rossi, my cleaning cart. I left it right outside the library doors. But worse than that, the rag I used, the one I dropped when I heard you, it has your blood on it. It's sitting right on the Brazilian cherry wood." Dominic's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking visibly beneath his pale skin. He looked at the monitor. Gabriel was pacing, speaking quietly into a tactical radio strapped to his chest. It was only a matter of time before his men expanded their search and found the bloody cloth. Once they did, they would tear the walls down to the studs. "You have to go back out there," Dominic said, his slate-grey eyes locking onto hers. It wasn't a command. It was a desperate plea from a dying king. "If they find that rag, we are both dead. You have to remove the evidence and misdirect him." "Are you insane?" Madeline gasped, taking a step back from the surgical table. "He's a murderer. He just tried to assassinate you. If he sees me, da! You are a ghost in this house, Madeline." "You said it yourself. You're just the housekeeper," Dominic interrupted, reaching out and gripping her wrist. His touch was burning hot with the onset of fever, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. "Look at me. I trust you. You kept your nerve while digging a bullet out of a Mafia boss. You can handle Gabriel. Use the hydrogen peroxide from your cart to lift the bloodstains from the wood. Tell him you cut yourself. Do whatever it takes to survive." He slid a heavy, customized Glock 19 across the stainless steel table toward her. "Take it." "I don't know how to use that," she trembled. "Point and pull, but keep it hidden. Only use it if you have absolutely no other choice." Madeline swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear coating her tongue. She took the weapon, its cold weight a terrifying anchor, and shoved it deep into the oversized pocket of her gray uniform apron. She grabbed a bottle of medical-grade hydrogen peroxide from the supply cabinet and hurried back down the concrete hallway. When she pushed the hidden latch, the heavy bookshelf opened just enough for her to squeeze through. She slipped back into the grand library, the air feeling suddenly freezing against her sweat-drenched skin. Gabriel was no longer on the main floor. He had moved out into the adjoining grand hallway. Madeline dropped to her knees, spotting the bloody rag instantly. She snatched it up, shoving it into her apron right next to the Glock. She uncapped the peroxide and poured it generously over the drops of Dominic's blood that stained the floorboards. The chemical reaction was immediate. The red spots bubbled and foamed into white froth. She scrubbed frantically with a clean microfiber cloth from her apron. Just as she wiped away the last streak of moisture, heavy footsteps echoed behind her. "Who's there?" "No." Gabriel's voice barked, the sound of a gun being drawn accompanying his words. Madeline stood up slowly, keeping her hands visible, holding only the bottle of peroxide and the clean cloth. She turned around, forcing her face into a mask of wide-eyed, innocent terror. Gabriel stood in the doorway, his custom-tailored Brioni suit contrasting sharply with the matte black silencer attached to his pistol. His right hand was wrapped tightly in a white bandage, dark blood seeping through the layers. His eyes, cold and dead, scanned her up and down. "Madeline, isn't it?" he asked, lowering the weapon slightly but not putting it away. "What the hell are you doing in the East Wing at 3 in the morning?" "Mr. Pascal, Rossi is hosting the regional directors tomorrow," Madeline lied smoothly, her nursing background helping her compartmentalize the sheer panic. The head housekeeper told me to do a deep polish of the baccarat crystal and the woodwork in the library. I've been here since midnight." Gabriel stepped closer, his heavy cologne doing little to mask the sharp scent of gunpowder lingering on his clothes. He looked at the floor where she had been kneeling. "What were you scrubbing just now?" Madeline held her breath. She needed an alibi, something undeniable. Without thinking, she reached into her apron pocket, bypassing the gun, and grabbed a small, sharp piece of wire attached to her cleaning caddy. In one swift, brutal motion inside her pocket, she dragged the wire across the palm of her left hand. The pain flared instantly, sharp and bright. She pulled her hand out, letting the fresh, bright red blood well up and drip onto the pristine floor. I was polishing the lower shelves and I snagged my hand on an exposed nail. She whimpered, letting genuine tears of pain prick her eyes. I was bleeding on the cherry wood. I panicked. Mr. Morse! Rossi would fire me if I ruined the flooring, so I ran to my cart for the peroxide to clean it up. Gabriel stared at her bleeding hand, then down at the faintly damp spot on the floor. He stepped forward, invading her personal space, his imposing figure towering over her. He reached out with his uninjured hand and grabbed her chin, tilting her face up. He studied her eyes, searching for deception. Madeline forced herself to look terrified, which wasn't difficult, but kept her gaze subservient. "Did you hear anything unusual tonight, Madeline?" Gabriel asked softly. "A loud noise? Someone running?" "Son, no sir," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Just the wind against the glass. Is something wrong? Should I evacuate?" Gabriel held her gaze for a suffocating 10 seconds. Finally, he released her chin and took a step back. "No. Go down to the staff quarters. Wrap that hand up. Do not come back to this wing until morning." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir," said Madeline, practically scrambled backward, grabbing her cleaning cart and pushing it out of the library. She didn't look back, though she could feel Gabriel's dead eyes burning into her spine until she turned the corner. She ducked into a supply closet, waiting until she heard Gabriel's heavy footsteps retreat down the main staircase. Shaking uncontrollably, she abandoned the cart, touched her bleeding hand, and sprinted back to the library, slipping silently behind the mahogany bookshelf once more. When Madeline burst back into the safe room, Dominic was sitting up on the edge of the surgical table, a heavy tactical vest strapped over his bare, heavily bandaged torso. He had an assault rifle resting across his knees, watching the monitors with predatory intensity. When he saw her bleeding hand, his expression shifted from cold calculation to a flash of raw, protective fury. "Did he touch you?" "I cut myself." It was the only way to explain the blood on the floor. Madeline gasped, leaning against the cold concrete wall to catch her breath. He bought it. But he's locking down the estate. He ordered his men to sweep the grounds with thermal cameras. Dominic let out a low curse. He stood up, wincing as the movement pulled at his fresh stitches. He walked over to her, taking her injured hand in his. He grabbed a fresh roll of gauze and gently wrapped her palm, his thumbs brushing against her knuckles. The contrast between the ruthless Mafia boss and the tender way he treated her injury sent a sudden, unexpected shockwave through her chest. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met," he murmured, his voice a gravelly rumble that vibrated in the small room. He looked up, his face inches from hers. "When this is over, you are never scrubbing another floor in your life." "I swear it on my name." Before Madeline could process the weight of his promise, Dominic turned back to the communications console. He picked up an encrypted satellite phone. "We have about 20 minutes before Gabriel's thermal drones pick up the heat signature from the ventilation shafts of this bunker," Dominic explained, punching in a long sequence of numbers. "I'm calling Mateo Navarro. He commands my loyalist faction out of Teterboro Airport. He'll bring a heavily armed extraction team." Dominic spoke rapidly in Italian into the receiver, giving precise coordinates and authorization codes. When he hung up, he racked the bolt of his rifle. "Mateo is 10 minutes out. He's coming by helicopter. When he lands, all hell is going to break loose on the front lawn." What do we do until then?" Madeline asked, a grip tightening on the Glock in her pocket. "We hold the line." The minutes dragged on like hours. On the monitors, Madeline watched Gabriel's men securing the perimeter, their flashlights cutting through the Hamptons fog. Suddenly, the monitor displaying the Grand Library flickered. Gabriel was back. And he wasn't alone. He had 2 men with him, and one was holding a massive Belgian Malinois on a short leash. The dog was sniffing frantically at the floor, directly over the spot where Madeline had poured the peroxide. The dog barked aggressively, throwing its front paws against the mahogany bookshelf. "Nah, he knows," Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly calm. On the screen, Gabriel smiled a cruel, vicious stretching of his lips. He signaled to his men, who raised heavy breaching shotguns, aiming directly at the center of the wooden structure. "Get behind the surgical table!" Dominic roared, shoving Madeline backward. A deafening explosion rocked the safe room. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling as the heavy bookshelf was blown to splinters. The reinforced steel door at the end of their hallway groaned under the impact, but it held. Over the intercom, Gabriel's voice echoed, distorted and manic. "I know you're in there, Dominic." "It's over. The commission in New York gave the green light. You're outdated. You're weak. Open the vault, and I'll make it quick. Come and get me, you treacherous bastard," Dominic growled to himself. Suddenly, a massive, thunderous roar shattered the night outside. The monitors showing the front lawn erupted in blinding flashes of light. Mateo Navarro had arrived. A sleek, blacked-out Sikorsky helicopter touched down directly on the manicured lawn, deploying a dozen heavily armed tactical operators in night vision gear. A brutal, one-sided firefight broke out as Mateo's elite team swarmed Gabriel's surprised guards. Gabriel, seeing the security feeds on his phone, panicked. He knew he had minutes before he was trapped. Desperate, he placed a shaped explosive charge on the steel door of the vault and backed away. "Cover your ears!" "I'll cover your ears," Dominic yelled. The blast blew the steel door off its hinges, sending it crashing into the safe room. Thick, acrid smoke poured into the room. Gabriel stepped through the threshold, coughing, raising his weapon. He never had a chance to fire. Dominic stepped out from behind the smoke, ignoring the agonizing pain in his gut, and fired 3 precise, devastating shots from his rifle. Gabriel collapsed onto the concrete floor, his eyes wide in shock as his life bled out onto the expensive baccarat crystal shards he had tracked in. Silence descended, heavy and final, broken only by the sound of approaching sirens in the distance and Mateo Navarro's men securing the hallways. Dominic dropped the rifle, his strength finally giving out. He fell to his knees, clutching his bleeding side. Madeline brushed forward, sliding onto the floor next to him, pressing her hands over his. "We made it!" she cried, tears finally breaking free. "You're safe." Dominic looked at her, his face pale but victorious. He reached up, wiping a tear from her cheek with a blood-stained thumb. "We are safe," he corrected softly. 2 weeks later, Madeline stood on the balcony of a private, heavily guarded penthouse overlooking the turquoise waters of Biscayne Bay in Miami. Her mother's medical bills at Mount Sinai Hospital had been completely zeroed out by an anonymous corporate benefactor. She wore a silk robe, a far cry from her gray maid's uniform. Footsteps sounded behind her. Dominic, leaning slightly on the cane, but looking as dangerous and immaculate as ever in a dark linen suit, wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. He kissed the side of her neck, pulling her against his chest. She had found a monster bleeding behind a wall, but in the ashes of betrayal, she had saved a king. And in return, he had given her the world. Did Madeline's breathtaking bravery and Dominic's fierce loyalty keep you completely on the edge of your seat? The criminal underworld is full of dangerous secrets, but the most powerful weapon of all is trust. If you loved this intense, twist-filled Mafia romance drama, please hit that like button, share this thrilling story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more heart-pounding, real-life-inspired storytelling every week.